everyone. Welcome to Exceed Online Post-Conference Summer Mini Courses. Long title, I know, even for being with you for a short time, but I'm excited to be here with you because today we're going to continue the PBL series. And it's the last time we're doing it live. So I'm really excited to be able to have a friend and a colleague join us as we sort of flesh out his art class PBL. I think he's entering his third year in on it. But Richard Sutton, I'm so grateful that he's able to join us in a few minutes. But before that, I'm going to share a 5-minute video just to remind us that project-based learning and problem-based learning, many times people say it's the same thing. Many times people say project-based learning leads to problem-based learning. But the reason why we need to review this is just to get your mind around the design and the planning for it. Because I know that a lot of you do it already, but it's just that with project-based learning and problem-based learning, that mindset is more intentional with what you're doing. And so many times I tell teachers, you're actually a lot of the criteria and a lot of the essentials of them. So let's watch project-based learning first, and then we're going to watch the problem-based learning.
Of shy and nerdy, my whole goal was to remain invisible. I had one friend, this kid named Matt. We were two nerds in a pod. And fortunately for me, he had perfect attendance until one day he didn't. He was sick, and it wasn't a big deal, but I stood in the cafeteria looking out at the sea of students, hoping someone would invite me over. But it didn't happen. I hid in the boys' restroom for the next 24 minutes, but it worked. I was invisible. But not to Mrs. Smoot or Mr. Darrell. They knew me. They knew I cared about social justice, baseball, and history, and so they invited me to do a history day project. And although it was fun, it was also terrifying. I had to plan my entire project and track my own progress. I had to figure out what questions to ask and where to find the answer. I had to narrow down the topic to something I cared about. In this case, Jackie Robinson and the integration of baseball. I wrote letters to newspapers and made phone calls to former players. I remember picking up the phone, my hands trembling as I read aloud my pre-recorded script and waited for the stranger to respond. I eventually worked on a slide presentation. That's when the most nerve-wracking moment occurred. I sat in a radio studio and I heard the script that I had just recorded, and I hated it. I'm not doing it, I said. But Mrs. Smoot looked me in the eyes and said, when you hide your voice, you rob the world of your creativity. And so I continued. I went ahead and I shared it with my class. And then I entered the district competition and the state competition and eventually went to Washington, D.C. And although I didn't realize it at the time, Mrs. Smoot was why I became an educator. This project helped me grow into a creative thinker and problem solver. And that experience is why I ultimately embraced project-based learning as a teacher. Now, I want to point something out. Project-based learning is different from simply a traditional classroom project. Project-based learning involves learning through projects rather than doing culminating projects. It involves student choice in design instead of just following a set of instructions. It includes student inquiry rather than pre-planned questions. It includes peer and self-assessment rather than only relying on teacher assessment. And it includes student ownership of the process rather than just teacher ownership of the process. The Buck Institute identifies the following 7 project design elements. Number 1, challenging problem or question. It has to start with something that truly engages students to solve a problem. Number 2, sustained inquiry. They needed the time to ask questions and explore the answers and engage in meaningful research. Number 3, authentic. It has to feel real to the students and tie into an actual context. Number 4, student voice and choice. They need to be the ones designing the entire project the entire time. Number 5, reflection. There needs to be frequent reflection along with a final reflection at the end. Number 6, critique and revision. Students need to engage in peer critique and constant iterative revision. And number 7, public product. They need to launch their work to an authentic audience. Now note that project-based learning can work in tandem with other pedagogical models such as inquiry-based learning, design thinking, and problem-based learning. But the key idea remains the same. The students are engaged in meaningful projects, and through that, they learn at a deeper level.
Okay, so now that was...
I promise. In the 1980s, somebody decided that haircuts were way too messy. So they combined the hair trimmer and the vacuum cleaner, and we ended up with the Flowbee. And I remember begging my parents for a Flowbee, and they said no, because they thought I would use it on the dog, and they were probably right. But the idea there is pretty clear, that you can solve problems in unique ways. And that's the core idea of problem-based learning. Number 1, the need for problem-based learning. School exists in a one-size-fits-all factory model where students are expected to passively consume content. But here's the thing, kids aren't widgets, and one-size-fits-all is great for socks but lousy for minds. Kids need to dream and wonder and imagine. They need to design and build and tinker, and they need to think critically and solve complex problems. For years, the model has involved going to school, being compliant, getting into college, and then climbing the corporate ladder. But the ladder is now a maze, and our students need to know how to navigate the complexity of a global society. In other words, students need to be empowered to solve real-world problems. And that's why we have problem-based learning. Number 2, the history of problem-based learning. Problem-based learning began at Case Western University in the 1950s, although it wasn't called that at the time. And the goal was to provide real-world problems for medical students to solve. It soon spread to other medical schools and eventually made its way into business, law, engineering, and education. And by the 1960s, you could find elements of problem-based learning within the new social studies framework of Macialis and Cox, as well as Herbert Thielen's group investigation model. Problem-based learning fits well within the social family of education because of the emphasis on real-world problems and human systems. It's not surprising that many of the problem-based learning theorists cite John Dewey's notion of democratic education, as well as Paulo Freire's concept of critical pedagogy. In other words, kids need to be engaged with solving problems within their world. And here's the description of problem-based learning. There are 4 different phases. Number 1, you present or identify the problem. In some cases, the teacher decides on the problem. In other cases, individual students or the entire classroom community presents the initial problem. Phase number 2, they develop a plan for solving the problem. Here, students work collaboratively in this phase where they figure out what they will do in order to solve the problem. In some cases, it's a really small plan of action, but sometimes they might engage in research, brainstorming, and ideation. And in a few cases, they might even decide to build a product. The next phase is the implementation of the plan. In this phase, students test out their plan to see if they can solve the problem. And then finally, they move to the last phase where they evaluate the implementation. Here, students analyze the results, and they also reflect on the process. Now, here's the ideal context for problem-based learning. Problem-based learning works best when students solve authentic real-world problems. Math teacher Dan Meyer warns against solving problems that contain pseudo-context, where students solve problems that don't actually reflect the way the world exists. So it's important that the problems feel real to the students. In social studies, students might broker peace in a war simulation. In math, they might determine the most efficient route for a trip. In language arts, they might figure out if a novel should be adapted into a movie. And in science, they might do a science fair project. But the key idea here is that it is not project-based learning, it's problem-based. And that's because you don't have to design a product. You're simply solving a problem. Ideally, students will solve problems that actually exist in their own world. And here's where the technology comes in. Our devices have a slew of apps that once required additional time and resources. And the problem-based learning provides a model that taps into both the connective and creative capacity of technology so that students can access the tools and the information to solve these real-world problems. So that is basically problem-based learning in less than 5 minutes.
Thank you. The last year it was face-to-face. And so when I visited with you all before COVID, I was able to take pictures and when did this start? Would you say day one?
Okay, so this project started 2 years ago in the fall of 2019.
Oh, okay. So when we say start, was it the planning or was it the implementation of what we're seeing here?
It was the implementation. The planning came where I came to the island in 2013, and there was another island, not Darrell's Island, but another one. And so there was another island that I saw off of the coast of mainland Bermuda. And with that island, I thought back to another project, which was Governor's Island, and developing the concept of Governor's Island. In terms of planning, it's been a project that I've done, not this particular project, but this kind of thinking and implementing in classrooms since 2009. So for Darrell's Island specifically, the fall was the planning shortly before the class started. Then introducing the class to the concept as a challenge and a problem to be able to rectify to enhance the island of Bermuda in general.
So if we were to choose between problem-based learning teaching approach and project-based learning teaching approach, would you loosely say, because we haven't, aligned every single thing of your design, would you say it's more project-based learning than problem?
Yes, it's definitely more project-based learning in terms of this particular assignment, because the students are discussing, they're working in small groups, and then the groups are crossing where they might have to refer to another group to help them with something else, and learning different skill sets. So all towards a larger project and a larger cause. Yeah.
Okay, so that is true, because looking at the visuals of what it looked like in the 1940s and what it looks like now in the 2000s, I'm sure you had to do some research, if not a lot, based on this space.
Okay, so this was the research and it was actually very interesting how it all unfolded. So when the class started, I proposed the concept to them, and they all liked the concept of transforming the space. So the island in 2000, or present day Darrell's Island, as you see it in the colored picture, the school would go on an end of year trip. In the past, we would go there for the students to play sports and swim and things like that. And the students were familiar with the lower half that you're seeing, from the green pasture down to the bottom. That looks kind of like a playfully called a chicken leg, right? The other part that is a little bit more covered with heavier foliage, we've never seen that part. So we're all familiar with the island and knew that the infrastructure needed updating and things like that. It's used for camping, and we had a basic understanding of the island. But what the discussion was, well, what would you like to see on the island itself, right? So as part of the development of the idea of the assignment, we went to the archival office in town to talk about the history of Darrell's Island. And we had a young man who was able to give us far more detail than we ever imagined. What he actually gave us went along with what was the hopes and dreams of what some of the students wanted to see on the island, whether it was camping, it was outdoor concerts, things of that nature. So it allowed us to solidify the ideas that we had and say, okay, it is part of the history of the island. Let's go back to the drawing board. And once we got back to the class, we are able to plan the trip to Darrell's Island itself and to put on paper what we wanted to see.
Now, when you say that the school traditionally has gone there for field trips, are you talking like over 10 years of?
Yes, over 10 years. Part of the tradition of the school, the culture of the school, is that end of year field trip for the whole school to go relax and spend time socializing with each other.
Is it just the private school you work at, or is it like traditionally all the schools?
I know it as our school. We
Okay.
use it for that reason.
Okay.
I know other schools have visited Darrell's Island, but I think it's for slightly other reasons.
Okay. Okay, so without going into, which would be intriguing, with going into, what they did back in the 1940s, 30s, 1920s, and what it was used for. Moving forward, so that way we can share with everyone the concept of the design and how it ended up going towards. Because if we're looking at, the students' work, what would have been the driving question or like the theme in the beginning, like redesign Darrell's Island, or redesign Darrell's Island as an educational space? What was the discussion back and forth with your students?
So the discussion, thank you. The discussion was, how can Bermuda, a beautiful paradise island, how can it become even more beautiful? And how can you offer space for people who cannot afford to leave Bermuda, a space for them to have a retreat within the island itself? And one of the things that I remember one young man talking about creating a water park. Well, we're surrounded by ocean. I don't know if that would be a really big sell on the island. It's not a bad idea, but what can we do to really hit it out the ballpark for something that would be a little bit more interactive for many different reasons or functions, right? So one of the things, and we talked about the intrigue in history, one of the things that we did learn was that Darrell's Island was the original airport site for Bermuda.
Oh.
So as being part of the original airport, an island, one of the structures that's left on the island is that airport, and it's derelict right now. So that was part of the discussion of, well, what can we do with this rich history of seaplanes landing and pulling up to Darrell's Island, and then people taking a boat or ferry over to mainland Bermuda. What can we do with the history of that? Because it's an important history of what is Bermuda before the airport was built in the 1940s, right? Another thing, and you can see the students cutting out the actual island. Another thing that we talked about was if the island has a history of outdoor concerts, can we create a space for that? So you see in the slide us taking the trip and the tour, and visualizing the actual space with what we actually wanted to do. So there's Javen taking pictures along the way, and that trail that you're looking at is actually kept. So the history of camping, the history of outdoor concerts, the airport, creating, and in this space, if you hold that slide, in this space, there is an atrium that's going to be right there, that's going to take up most of that space, a building that is built on the concept of biomimicry, incorporating biology or nature and architecture, so that that atrium can have a varied reasons or varied uses for the community.
But okay, so if you're saying 2019 and it's now school year 2021, 2022, how many field trips have you done? Well, because of COVID, what happened? Maybe we should go back to that.
So we took 2 field trips, one to the archival office, and then this slide over to Darrell's Island itself. And then COVID hit in March, and we were just about the middle of the project. And that's when everything came to a halt. There was no field trips. There was no in-school learning for about, I think, up to April. So once we returned to close the school year, and the project was at a standstill. Introducing the project to another group to complete, there wasn't any field trips that were offered at that time because of COVID.
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, you pretty much just halted, like stopped.
Correct.
Then you restarted it in the new school year, because I know that some of them were seniors.
Correct.
So you had to restart.
So restarting, actually, majority of them were in the 12th grade and graduated. The class ended with online learning, which was heavily on design concepts and design lectures, and various designers talking about their experience. So just building an awareness of the importance of design in the world. And the new group that came in, I had to reintroduce them to the concept of what is design, what are the 9 principles of design, and then what is urban design and urban planning, what's that all about? So taking them through, again, the history of that, and then looking specifically as in Bermuda itself, if Dubai and Singapore can do wonderful things, why can't a wonderful island like Bermuda offer something that's similar? So that was the pitch, and then we jumped straight into the making and the continuation of the building of the project. So one of the things that I like to do is challenge students to see, one, what the skill set is, and just their creativity. So I give them a piece of paper, a slightly thicker paper, and then scissors and tape, and then I ask them to make a box, right? So to be able to manipulate the paper and cut it into the shape that would need to be cut to attain a box, some of them had challenges with, and that also allowed me to see who's going to be doing what based on certain skill sets. So some students were laying down grass, some were building trees, others were building and helping with the building of structures.
Well, that's encouraging to know that in spite of a setback, COVID, and such a huge project, you were still able to teach the basic concepts of design in an art class without, without being face to face. Because using Spindle, SPINNDLE, everyone, spindle.com, they have free resources if you want to do a project-based learning unit in your classroom. It can be a 1 month PBL unit, it could be a 1 week, it could be a 6 month or a whole year. So if we were to fill this out based on what Richard has done, because with his students, because we know now after 2 years, he still can present to government officials, right? Because that was the initial idea.
Correct.
Okay, so if we were to write it out, which technically, Richard, we will write it out, right? Because this is such a rich experience for everyone. So using the Spindle's project planner, let's just give the project name what you gave it, A New Place. Why was it again?
Why was that? I'm sorry?
Yes. Why was it called A New Place?
So the title of the project, it came about after we started the project, and I started tying in all of the other art classes under a theme, A New Place, right? So you have some kids looking at art history, some kids looking at graffiti and the effects of graffiti on their environment. Some kids are just creating worlds within their computer boxes. So, a brand new computer comes in a box, and students open the box and can build as if creating set designs as part of a stage within that box, and painting and building, so that they're getting a smaller dose of what the Darrell's Island project is like, but creating worlds that they have a point to make or would like to see, whatever the case is, maybe looking at Salvador Dali. So all of that tying in so that all of the work and all of the classes connect back to this original idea of Darrell's Island and creating new spaces that people can enhance people's lives.
So as an art teacher, you have to rely on how you build and design your curriculum. It's...
Yes. Earlier in my teaching career, I came to understand that some parents didn't value art education. You'd have parent-teacher conferences, and some will drizzle through, but it was not until I started incorporating using the same design principles, looking at architectural design or automotive design, and then again urban planning design with Governor's Island in New York, that I saw people sit up and pay attention, because you're looking at real world problem solving, and it validated beyond parents saying, well, I don't think I'm too keen on my student, my child being an artist. But when it came to design, they perked up a lot more. And being able to plan in this capacity, it keeps me on my toes. It keeps the job interesting. And I think that real world problem solving aspect is embraced by everyone.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because it is important, not just in art, but in all grades and in what teachers do. Do you find yourself doing this more than when you did when you first started teaching? You kind of alluded to that earlier.
I fell into it.
Okay.
Quite honestly, it's something that I designed a class, 3D art and design, based on just the building experience. So you have a design component, which I would say would probably take 3/4 of the year, depending on the project. And then the art component. So you're using clay or stone to be able to create a 3-dimensional art piece.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And as time has gone on, I have tried to incorporate the building aspect in the other classes as well. the young kids, they see what's going on and they ask, hey, can we do something that's similar, or can we do that too? And I have been pushing to provide that opportunity for them.
Yes. So your intention is project-based learning. When we're looking at this project planner, as we see here, the title, A New Place, as we see, step 2 would be the final product to actually build the model of
Correct.
of what it could be.
Correct.
Okay. And possible showcase opportunity would be presenting it to the government officials.
The long-term goal is to present the final project to government officials. Before that, the other, or maybe after that, the other goal is to present it here in Bermuda. We have an art show that is with all of the schools on the island, middle through high school, right?
Oh, nice.
So to be able to, as a small Adventist school, present our work like this for all of the schools to see what we're doing, I think would enrich the experience of the show, enrich the students or school pride, to be able to say we did this and to be able to talk about it intelligently, and have that opportunity to have the government officials look at it. And I told the students, imagine if we can tickle their fancy and tickle the notions of what are we going to do with this 21 acres island, so that it can provide job opportunities and enhance lives of the Bermudians.
And that's the whole goal, is for students to see through design, through building, planning, design, building, enhancing their area, taking pride in where they live, where they're from,
right,
and where they exist. Because if moving forward to step 3 and 4, project framework, like as in the States, you know, they use NGS standards, new generation science standards. You can use the national art standards, Journey to Excellence, Adventist standards. The framework library for preserving historical places is a rich experience for everyone involved.
Correct.
So I personally see the value in that. If we move over to step 4, project overview, it looks like you're pulling a lot from the idea. Because of COVID, you had to, but then it was a plus to emphasize design and showing the principles of design through other models.
Yes. Yes, it allowed the opportunity where students might have had the homework assignment here or there to be able to look at a video of a designer. We were able to do together in class. We were able to invite an architect, a local architect, to be able to talk with us about her experience as going to school, and then architect, what is it called? Landscape design and architecture, and you know, just allow the students to see that they can do this kind of work as well. Just building the awareness of what it takes.
And making that connection. You're right. I have a cousin's husband who graduated with an MBA and an engineering degree, and they moved to Vegas, and he's now running a landscaping company. And everyone's like, how is that related? It's related because now he's an engineer, following landscape designers, or he even hired one because it's needed for a landscaping company on a large scale.
Yeah.
So that's one of the real world connections, I would say. So time is just really pressing here. So how about we just quickly go through this? You broke your PBL, let's just call it your PBL project, into different steps. You had to, in spite of COVID. But what is your next step now? You had COVID, you were in and out of the classroom, kids learn in and out of the classroom.
What is the next step?
Mm-hmm. Just for this school year. We can talk about future and big picture, but for this school year.
Can I show you the actual model to explain the next step?
Oh, sure. So do you want me to, or you're going to show it. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
let's
I'll
stop
turn it
share.
around. All right, so it's still a work in progress. This is part of the island. You have the lazy river. You can see the scale of the guy in the restaurant here. You can see the atrium. So
Wow.
what's left is just finishing off a couple
Wow.
structures. And then right here, we have a young lady who's building a restaurant. And we're going to build some gardens in this area. Here, I was able to buy a seaplane, and it's going to
Nice.
be a mounted display to honor the museum. This will be the museum space here, but that needs finishing. So the atrium is that biomimicry, as I was saying.
Oh, yes.
So these people, we're going to put them all over the island, the little white people, so that everyone can see the
Oh,
scale.
oh, yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So for what's left, I bring you over here. Now this is a wooden base that's going to be put underneath. We had our maintenance team build it for us. But this restaurant is going to be finished and it's going to be set in place. Over here.
Oh, that's what you're talking about. Well,
Right.
oh, okay.
So here you
I
have an
see.
infinity pool, grass flowing,
Oh, okay.
still a very natural kind of feel to it,
Yeah.
but extending the island for the restaurant's sake slightly for this terrace area. Okay, a very high-end restaurant and your burgers and fries kind of restaurant with a lazy river on this end. All right. So once that is completed, then we will have to put it away and make the appointments and to practice the presentation for the discussion with public officials and anyone else that's interested in hearing and seeing this project.
Did you ever use rubrics throughout the whole process?
The rubrics that were used were just based on the history component, the design and understanding design component, and then looking at the task for the building. I didn't have an actual rubric, but looking at completing tasks, right? So the students would have to build something and then correct it based on specification for what that structure was or is. Yeah.
I'm curious about the standards without going into the standards. Are those type of questions in their standardized tests there as junior seniors?
In their standardized tests, certain skill sets, whether it's geometry or math and cutting and
yes,
understanding certain things, are being exercised away from the math class. So you have some cross-curricular opportunity as well. And then that would show up in the standardized test.
Granted, if they weren't going to be art majors, going into college, I'm sure you pointed out to them why it was relative to real life skills.
Correct. So the one thing that I tell my students is that my job is not to make them an artist. My job is to build an awareness, and my job is to make them creative thinkers, because in every industry, creative thinkers, innovation is needed. So with this kind of project, you have a lot of problem solving where maybe one student is working on one aspect of the project and might have difficulty. So there was one young man who he really struggled in cutting and building, and anything that was that kind of skill set, he had a really hard time. And as the course went on, what I actually did was I had him assist another young man in making trees, right? Just putting them together, gluing them together, and putting them in the ground. And I think that built some of the confidence. The early trees weren't very good, and they got better. But towards the end, I think shortly before COVID hit, he was actually the one who built the basketball court. He's into basketball. So I said, all right, find the basketball court, print it out to the size that we need it to be. And now the hard part for you, I need you to build a backboard, a rim, and the stand or the pole that holds it together. Well, how am I going to do that? I said, well, let's figure it out. So I gave him some basic materials, and he actually was able to execute it in a very, very well, did a really, really good job.
I saw.
And he was proud and confident to take on another task.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he mastered and conveyed it properly. I mean, if you were to say that he was given something and then he, a task, and then he took the principles of design from that into something he was passionate about.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's relative to a lot of things that the kids are passionate about.
Right. And being here in Bermuda and playing a lot of outdoor basketball, what would be an ideal outdoor basketball space for him? What would he want to see? So, just different tasks for different kids, different skill sets, and then building from that. But all of them were responsible for, in the very same way, reporting on the information on video, introducing things that were happening in Dubai or Singapore, or just what is the sprawl, defining sprawl, and what was the problem with sprawl, and why cities are looking to change their design so that people aren't stuck in traffic trying to cross LA, and making smaller communities for people to have easier lives.
That is definitely, especially in the city, city design, traffic, in Hawaii alone, you have one highway, H1, and you have millions of people. How do they solve those types of problems too?
Right.
So I don't know where this could go, but as far as talking with an official, we could be presented later, whenever that later is. Could we possibly have that conversation another time?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
What was happening in the past was to have a meeting with the intellectual properties manager for the whole island and working with him to set up the presentation with other officials and such.
Okay. Perfect. We're going to end this session with a couple of videos from PBL Works on design, instruction and design in PBL. And then hopefully there's a segment where we can show how biomimicry and nature connects in designing in the building with students. In this particular video, it's with the bioscience architect and her students. So Richard, we want to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You can get the inspiration and the idea of building big, but thinking small.
Designing takes place before a project starts, but you can't always predict how it's going to go because students may. When planning a project, the Buck Institute's model for gold standard PBL has 7 essential project design elements, and those are good guidelines for teachers to follow.
So teachers often ask, where do good project ideas come from? And the answer is so many places. You might start with a unit that you've taught many times in the past in a very traditional way and revise it, remodel it into project-based learning, paying attention to those design elements that really take learning in a deeper direction.
When I'm designing these projects, I sort of think about what these real-world applications are. Is it authentic? Can I sustain the interest of students for a long period of time? Will kids develop a passion? What kind of questions will it inspire?
But to get your own ideas for projects, look at things like your community, your students' interests, things that are going on in their lives, their culture, their identity. It's also great to get feedback from colleagues on your project design because that improves the quality of the project. And it also models for students the kind of critique culture you want them to have.
Nothing builds engagement like a project that grows right out of a student's own passion or interest or question.
And I always think about the end in mind. Where is it that I want it to go? What do I want the format to look like? And are there milestones along the way where kids can have a lot of flexibility and a lot of choice?
It could be things from the news, from current events, pop culture. It can also be things that are happening in your community, real world problems you want students to solve, or the kind of problems that adult professionals face in their lives.
Some teachers also wonder, do I have to constantly be designing new projects? You'll find that many project ideas are kind of evergreen. You can reuse them from one year to the next or from one class to the next. Others become actually part of a tradition of a school. These are projects that students kind of anticipate. By the time I'm in X grade, I get to do this awesome project that I've been hearing about for years.
Planning also involves collecting resources for a project. For example, you might need to arrange equipment or materials for students.
And just as important as the stuff, you want to think about the people who are going to be resources for the project. People who might enter your classroom as experts, content experts, or professionals in the disciplines that your students are now working in. If they're working as historians or scientists or photographers or whatever the case may be, those sorts of folks are great to have available to answer students' questions, be role models, really show them what this discipline is like by those who are practicing it every day.
A 401k plan is a retirement plan that employers offer as a benefit.
But not too different from that concept drawing, right? We have the bedrooms up here.
So I learned when I was a teenager about movies.
One other resource you want to think about for your project is who are the people who are going to be the audience for students' work. So we think of project-based learning as having a public product. Public can mean lots of different things. It might mean a big hall full of very interested, engaged audience members, or it might be a small panel of people who are very connected to the problem that your students are wrestling with and have developed some solutions for.
We assume put $5,000 for each kid, and you saving up $50 a month. All right, so about by the time he's 18, we have saved over $19,000.
And again, you want to remain flexible because students may well have some ideas of their own when it comes to who do they want to share their work with.
At the end of a project, teachers can ask students to reflect on how it went.
Now is your time. You're going to get 2 minutes to talk about what you've learned.
They think about what they learned, how they accomplished their tasks, any roadblocks they met, and how they overcame them. It's a great way to both improve the quality of the project for next time and to just sort of inform your growth as a project.
Where you can go to find the elements of PBL and to be able to transfer it in your teaching method, in your teaching approach. One teacher said, I can't do PBL this year, but I can do some of the elements. I can do some of the essentials. And I said, okay, sure. And when I saw her last week, I think it was, she said, well, how do I show student voice and choice? And I said, well, how are you setting up your classroom this school year? Do they have, or do they own space in one of your cupboards, many cupboards in the classroom? She said, no, not really. I said, well, then maybe your student chores can reflect that. And if they have a role in their chore to inspect supplies, whether it's to make sure that the makerspace area is ready for tinkering tomorrow or next week, whatever the case may be, leading students to hands-on activities where they have a student voice and choice in it, or designing and they have a student voice and choice in it in the class meeting, whatever the case may be. You can incorporate a few things here and there. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an hour. It's been a lovely time with you all. And I know that most of you are watching this post live session. So if you have any questions, make sure that you email exceed@lu.edu or cespina@lu.edu.